We're coming to you today live from the production studios here in Tyson's BLC Digital Strategies. Todd Castleberry's got us looking good here today, president of BLC Digital Strategies. I'm Declan Leonard. I am managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard, and I also head up the firm's employment law practice.
And I'm Kristin Zech. I'm one of the employment law attorneys here.
And Kristin, thanks for being here today. This is our first webinar of 2024. We're in our second year, we're proud to say, in our second year. We do these on a quarterly basis. We try to pick topics that are forward-looking for companies. And I think today's is a good one. Today we're going to be talking about the trend towards unlimited PTO, and so now that the calendar has turned 2024, companies are looking at PTO policies and seeing what kind of tweaks they can make. So let's just dive right into it. Like, first off, give me some background. PTO versus unlimited PTO?
Sure. So unlimited PTO is a rather recent development, and the concept here is that we take traditional PTO, which is usually vacation leave, sick leave, any combination thereof of leave that an employer provides, and we put it into a single bucket called PTO. And we've had, bucket PTO policies for a long period of time. That's nothing new. What is relatively new is this idea of unlimited PTO, which means that we're not necessarily tracking. You're not getting 4 weeks of PTO. We have PTO that can be used in a flexible manner. Okay. And I should have said, for those watching live here today, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A. We will be fed those questions throughout. So, some of this stuff is technical. We'll try to answer as much as we can. But if you need to follow up with us after this, we're always happy to talk about this stuff. We like geeking out on employment law. So anyways, okay, so we know unlimited PTO. It's a big trend. It's a big buzzword in HR. Talk about what it really means. So what it means is that, again, rather than having a set amount of PTO per year, so as an employee, I have 4 weeks of PTO that I can use in any fashion I so choose in accordance with the policies. Instead of having that 4-week period that's allotted to me either at the beginning of year or that's accrued, there's no tracking of it necessarily. I can take leave as I need. It's not a set 4 weeks. Maybe I take 2 weeks. Maybe I take 6 weeks. Maybe I take none, depending upon what my needs are.
I like to call it adult time off. In other words, we're not treating employees like, we're going to check this down to the last minute that you're taking off. We're going to trust you to go out and get your work done. In a perfect world, get your work done, and when you need to take off, you need to take off. So talk about some of the advantages that people are seeing with this trend towards less just strict PTO and more unlimited or flex PTO.
I think it's exactly what you said. It's the idea that if you do your work, we're going to trust you to be a responsible adult, get your work done, and then you're going to take whatever leave you need aside from that once your work is done. So you have that trust component with your employees. It definitely is a selling point for a lot of recruiters at this point. It meshes well with the idea of flexible work or remote work, that concept that you have more control over your work environment.
And most, or perhaps a lot of people watching today and who will watch this when it's sent out in a recorded form are HR administrators. Makes their life easier too, at least in theory. I know you and I talk about this all the time.
We may disagree slightly on this. Certainly on the front end of it, it does seem to make their life easier because as opposed to tracking whether, Susan has taken 2 hours off on Monday, we're not as concerned about that. We're more concerned about whether or not Susan has gotten her work done. However, and we'll get to this as we move on, there are a lot of other components that come into this.
And there's also a cost saving, theoretically, there's a cost-saving component of this because, as we know, for regular or normal PTO policies, a lot of times state law mandates that those be paid out when somebody leaves, or companies themselves have policies in place that say, we will pay out, upon your departure, we'll pay out any unused but accrued PTO. Talk about how this changes it, at least in theory.
It may change it. So
We're such lawyers. We're always equivocating.
Well, but I think this is an important point, Declan, because what is going on right now is unlimited PTO is a relatively recent creature.
That's true, yeah.
And the law hasn't necessarily caught up with how industry is functioning. So there's a lot of questions you're going to pose to me I don't have the answers for, at least in a definitive sense of how a court is going to rule. And this is one of those areas. You're correct. If you have a company policy that requires PTO to be paid out at termination, and all of a sudden you have an unlimited PTO policy, there is no accrued PTO that's going to be paid out. On the other hand, there are two different situations. One, there are state laws. Certain states require PTO to be accrued and paid out. And in other cases, there's the question of what happens when you transition from a traditional PTO policy to an unlimited PTO policy, and whether or not any leave that's accrued has to be paid out at that time.
Yeah, we're going to jump into that because the transition from a regular or a normal PTO policy to an unlimited or a flex, just something different than just the regular PTO, that's got some kinks to it that we got to deal with. One other advantage that I think companies see sometimes is you see this trend that people save up their PTO because a lot of times they're accruing it paycheck by paycheck by paycheck, and sometimes they save it up to that second half of the year or even closer to the holidays, and sometimes those are very busy times for companies, and yet you see a lot of people taking time off. So I think when you move to this more flexible or unlimited PTO policy, people have more control over when they take it. I mean, they can plan a vacation in the first quarter of the year, which sometimes they have not been able to do so. So I think that helps spread it out a little bit more.
I think you're right when it comes to an accrual policy. I do think you still have those issues in terms of scheduling, because naturally around the holidays, around breaks, school breaks, people are going to take PTO. And that's something that whether it's unlimited or whether it's a traditional policy, you still as an employer have to be scheduling ahead of time and preparing your business for those times.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Okay, so we talked about the advantages, what companies see as the advantages, at least on paper. Let's talk about some of the disadvantages of moving from just a regular PTO policy to an unlimited or a flex policy.
The number one disadvantage from my perspective is that unlimited is not unlimited. There is some limit. Whatever employer you are, there is some idea in your mind for what is an acceptable amount of time and what is not.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to be candid about that, both in terms of our expectations as employers and also for our employees. If they come in with the perspective that they can be out 365 days a year or 364 days a year, that's not going to fly.
Yeah, no, I think what we're probably both of the same mindset that we're going to espouse that this whole concept of calling it unlimited PTO is probably a bit of a misnomer and probably not the way to go. And so we'll be talking about that next. Let's talk about that. We prefer flex PTO, or calling it flex PTO versus unlimited, and talk about what you see as the difference between the two.
When I think of flex, I think of really flexibility. When you look at unlimited, it's really what I was saying, this idea that I have complete freedom and I have truly no limits on what I'm going to do. That's simply not the case.
Yeah.
What this is a situation where the employer has and the employee have flexibility in how that PTO is going to be administered. It's not a set amount of time. It may be a year where you've had more issues come up that have kept you out of the office, or it may be a situation where you've worked a lot more hours than you typically would.
Yeah.
So there is that balancing more so than you would see perhaps in a traditional policy.
So when you talk about a policy, if you were advising a company, and of course we do this all the time when we advise companies on how to set these up, how do you start? Do you start with immediately just going into a policy, or is there a certain analysis of what are they trying to do here with the particular company?
I think that analysis is critical.
Yeah, before you jump into it.
Right, and I think you have to recognize too, an unlimited or a flex time policy, however you denominate it, may not be appropriate for every employer. And that's something that you should assess at the beginning. Is this right for your company? What is your company's perspective? What is your philosophy? If you are somebody who expects all of your employees to be there, 10 hours a day, this may not work well for you. What is your industry? There are some industries where there is a strict schedule. You have to have coverage, and having this concept of flexible PTO doesn't mesh very well. Then
go ahead.
Then you also have to look at your employees and whether or not this is appropriate for the employees that you have.
You and I were talking about a client, obviously will remain unnamed, but came to us and said, we need unlimited PTO. That's the trend. We got to hit the trend. And then when we started really like sort of sitting down and saying, okay, what is it that you want to offer, and what is it you're trying to accomplish? Next thing you know, they ended up not going down that road.
That's correct. We had a lot of hurdles in that situation. We had a number of states that were involved that had mandated sick leave requirements, and once we tried putting together the policy, it just really wasn't workable as an unlimited policy.
It's interesting because people think, there is a potential for abuse, obviously, whenever there's unlimited, depending on the employee. But studies show that for unlimited PTO, they actually take less time than more traditional established PTO policies. The numbers that came out last year were, on average, people who had an unlimited PTO policy took 13 days per year, versus 15 days when there was just more of a set PTO policy.
That's true. And again, we're early in the lifespan of these unlimited PTO policies, so this remains to be seen. But I think that that's something we need to consider. We know that time off is important for employees to recharge. We know that productivity increases when people are happier. So this becomes a question, is if people are taking less time because they feel more pressure, is that something that you as an employer need to address in your culture?
And in fact, it's interesting, a lot of companies that have adopted these more flex or unlimited plans, they actually have put a mandatory minimum that you need to take. It's like, get out of here, kind of force you out. There's a company called Bending Spoons who offered a $1,000. They offer a $1,000 stipend to employees who take 5 or more days off of work. In other words, just trying to really incentivize them, because, like you said, if it's just there as a piece of paper but it's not being used, it not only doesn't work, it's counterproductive. It destroys morale in a company.
And I've seen that, candidly, I've seen that with traditional PTO policies as well, where the employers recognize that their employees do need to get out. They need to get out for consecutive days.
Yes.
And they do push that.
Yes. So we do have a question. Okay, so we're getting questions popped up here on the screens. Very fancy, Todd. Way to go. Does an unlimited PTO policy affect employees differently if they are remote or working across multiple jurisdictions?
There's a lot in that question. Let's take the remote part first. I don't think that it affects remote employees differently. I think with remote employees, we're always concerned when you have a remote employee about productivity and ensuring that an employee is doing what they need to do. I don't see unlimited PTO being an issue that is more complicated for remote employees. Actually, with unlimited PTO, one of the key components we're going to talk about having is some sort of mechanism to measure performance, whether that's regular check-ins, whatever it may be. Because once you're not looking at absences, you really need to look at that metric of performance.
So it's not whether they're remote or not, but it depends on where they are remote, because we do know that different jurisdictions, different states is where complications in setting up one of these policies comes into play.
Absolutely. And candidly, that changes almost day to day at this point. We are seeing laws coming out from every jurisdiction. And the one thing I would say is if you have employees across multiple jurisdictions, you need to be talking to your employment attorney and on a regular basis, because it is changing constantly.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, so you have that conversation with your client and you say, you know what, we're a good candidate for this. Let's move to this. Let's switch over. What are some of the policies on paper that you would advise companies to put into place here? You don't just say, hey, guess what? We're flipping the switch to unlimited. What types of things should they be putting in there? Guardrails, basically, so that the opportunity for abuse is lessened.
I think the key word you said there is a policy. You need to have a policy. You need to have a written policy. You need to have a clear policy. You need to have a policy that's disseminated disseminated to your employees so that they know exactly what's going on, because those guardrails are critical. A couple of items, and we can walk through them one by one. Number one, scheduling. You still need to run your business, and it is important. This is not, flex time, unlimited, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't mean that I just don't show up to work tomorrow.
Not a free-for-all,
No, I need to tell you, if I'm taking extended vacations, I should let my employer know ahead of time so that, coverage can be handled. Obviously, emergencies come up, but there should still be a procedure in place for reporting emergencies. If you have somebody who's consistently having an emergency on Friday mornings at 9 a.m., or Monday mornings at 9 a.m., or Friday afternoons at 4 o'clock,
or 3
every week, then we need to look at issues in terms of discipline and how you're addressing it. So I think scheduling is a critical component of this.
Okay, so it's scheduling, supervisor approval, notice requirements. Putting you have the freedom to put these in place. But look, if you're going to be gone for 5 days or more, you're going to get advanced supervisor approval. All that stuff, it should be laid out. The expectations should be there.
Correct. I think there are two other components that we really need to look at that are tangential to this but essential. Number one, and I mentioned it a moment ago, which is a disciplinary program. You need to have the ability in your HR department and with your managers to follow through if there are issues. We can't let issues fester for a full year before they're addressed on performance. And going hand in hand with that, you need to have performance criteria. The only way that we are assessing performance at this point is really what is the work product that's coming out. If you don't have that criteria in place, then you really have no mechanism to measure this.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this, the whole conundrum of, do we track time, do we not track time? And it is tough, because the more you go in the direction of tracking time, the more you're sort of turning away from this being a flex or unlimited, or as I call it, adult time. I've always said, you got to focus on performance. People can take time off, but if they're getting their job done, that's what you should be focusing more on than just, you took this amount of time in February and this amount of time in March. That's my opinion.
I think there's another side to it, though. And, part of a job is not just, well, not all jobs, but part of many jobs is not just, your output. Part of that is also being part of the workplace and the environment. And look, it becomes an issue if you have an employee who is out on vacation every other week. That's something that's seen by your workforce. So that's something I think you also have to control.
Yeah, and in fact, a question just came up. It's like they read my mind. Can you discipline, when you have one of these policies, can you discipline them for excessive absenteeism? That's kind of the point I was just making. I would not say it just as excessive absenteeism. I would say your lack of attendance here is impacting your performance. And here's how it's impacting your performance. You were supposed to do this deliverable, and this deliverable, and it didn't get done. So I think if you just say, hey, you're just away too much, then the employee's going to come back and say, wait a sec, I get my work done, I get good, feedback from the client. Do we have unlimited? Do we have flex? Or is this really just, kind of a Pyrrhic policy? I think that's the way to go.
I would agree. Absenteeism is a problem. If the work is getting done, then, obviously it's less of an issue here. But again, there are those other components that play into it. And, if you're not in the workplace, is there an impact to your colleagues?
Yeah.
There very well may be.
So an important issue now is, we've talked about vacation and sick leave, but that's not the only types of leave that companies offer. So talk about how some of these other leaves, what are they, and how do they interact with these policies if companies put them in place?
Are you raising the specter of FMLA? Is that where you're going with this?
FMLA, parental leave, military leave, leave without pay, all of those other leave that when I look at handbooks, I see all of those in there too.
So this is one of those areas that is really unknown legally on what happens. And let's take FMLA as an example, because that's probably the elephant in the room here. FMLA, as I'm sure you know, is 12 weeks of unpaid leave for a serious health condition. And there's some other qualifying components in there with job protection.
And it's unpaid.
Yep. And that can be taken either consecutively, it can be taken intermittently, so that it's federally protected. We have to be concerned about it. Unlimited or flex time PTO does not replace FMLA. Yeah. And I think this becomes critical for employers. So, in implementing this sort of flex policy, you need to make sure that your HR department is on top of what's going on, particularly with FMLA. One thing that employers do is they are the ones that designate FMLA. And it's critical when it comes to something like this that employers are doing that they are looking when their employees have serious health conditions and they're being proactive on this. Otherwise, you run into a situation where, you have an employee who has been on flex PTO for 1, 2, 3 weeks perhaps, and that's FMLA time.
Yeah, you don't want a situation where you have set up one of these new policies and somebody then, God forbid, has to, go take the full 12 weeks for an illness or something like that, and they say, the good thing is I'm going to get paid for that entire 12 weeks because I have unlimited leave. So you got to be careful and be sure that you have a policy that excludes these things. You want to make sure you know what things are going into the bucket of unlimited or flex PTO and what things are just going to be standalone separate policies. And then you got to make sure those policies very specifically exempt out, that they're not covered. Military leave, under USERRA, can be for a very long period of time. And if your policy for unlimited leave really just leaves it very wide open that this is really what it is, then that employee can make a good argument that they should be paid during that period.
Absolutely. And again, that's where having a strong HR department comes in, because they are the ones who are really managing this and seeing these interactions. The other area where we need to be careful really is with the ADA and reasonable accommodations.
That's right, yeah.
Because a reasonable accommodation can be time off from work.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. So all of these laws, kind of flow into it. So you've just got to make sure that you're not just, riding the trend and saying, yep, here's an email, subject line, unlimited PTO. For now on, it's all unlimited. I mean, this has got to be a very carefully done process. It's got to be done not just with that policy, but with these other types of leaves that are in mind. Otherwise, you're going to set your company up for, not only are you going to set your company up for a major financial hit potentially, but it's not good for morale, because let's face it, human nature, people are going to look and say, wait a second, they're getting paid for all 12 weeks. I haven't even taken 1 week off this, so you got to make sure that you think it through and realize how it's going to work in practice. So a very important topic, because like we said, this is a new trend. I think in 2022, I saw a data that said 4% of companies have moved to unlimited PTO. A lot of them are the startups, the California companies where they are, kind of following the latest trends and stuff. I think now that we're in 2024, I think that number is probably definitely in the double digits. But many of them just had regular PTO policies. So let's talk about that process. Very fun process of transferring or transitioning from a regular PTO to unlimited or flex PTO.
As we said, when it comes to creating your policy, communication with your employees is key. And it's really important that when you are transitioning to a flex policy, that you provide advance notice to your employees of exactly what's going on. This is something that you want to plan in advance. This is not something that necessarily happens overnight. If you have, for example, leave that needs to be paid out under various state laws, we want to make sure that we have calculated that for when is the opportune time in the year to transfer over, as well as helping employees use PTO that may still exist.
Yeah, I think the key here is state law is very dominant in this area, because various states look at leave that are provided by employers differently. There are some states, California, Colorado, Illinois, I believe, that say, listen, when you offer leave, that is a vested benefit. That is almost akin to wages. And so you're not able to forfeit these very quickly. There are other states, Texas, Virginia being kind of one of them too, where it's more contractual in nature. So you're going to look at, okay, what's the policy? What's the agreement between the employer and the employee?
And even complicating that, when we look at the policies or the contracts, what they typically say is upon termination.
Yes.
Well, that raises a huge question at this point, because you're not terminating employment, but on the other hand, taking a page from California, these are wages. This is time that has been earned, and California has even referred to it as essentially a form of deferred compensation.
Oh, got it.
So if you have a situation where you're not terminating employment, but this benefit is being taken away, there's a serious legal question right now as to whether it needs to be paid.
And there is no bright line guidance, but you can you want to approach this in such a way that you're cautious about it. What is one way to do so? We talked about this transition period. How would that work in practice?
So a transition period would basically be a situation where you would tell employees, look, in 6 months, we are going to convert to an unlimited PTO. We're not accruing any more PTO unless required by law. But in the meantime, here's your time to use up existing PTO that you have. And then on July 1st, we are moving. Another option is to have essentially a rolling move where employees exhaust existing accrued PTO and move over. A third option, it's not really a transition period as we've been talking about, but some employers actually bank that time and then pay it out upon termination.
Got it. I see what you're saying. And then I guess, it can have, obviously if you just said, I'm going to take the path of least resistance and pay it all out as we transition, that's very costly. And so we tend to guide against that and say, you know what, there are a couple of other ways where you can sort of mitigate against this. I think it is important to say, though, that once you do transition over to one of these flex policies, not every state looks at it and says you're off the hook. And not every city does either. For instance, Chicago, our good
I knew
friends.
You were going to bring Chicago up.
Yes,
so
yes.
This is relatively new, and I cannot say enough that you should be working with your employment law counsel anytime you're working multi-jurisdictionally, just because these laws are constantly changing. Chicago has a new law that has come out, and essentially what Chicago requires, there's 40 hours of required PTO plus 40 hours of required sick leave. Chicago requires that PTO be paid out at termination. And it's not that it's a full 40 hours, it's 40 minus whatever has been used. So if you're if you have employees in Chicago and you have an unlimited PTO policy, in theory, there's still going to be some tracking that's involved here.
Yeah, we track state by state very closely for our clients because most of our, government contractor clients and regular commercial clients, it's just the nature of it now where their employees are spread out so far across the United States. But this is an example where you can't even look at Illinois. You got to look one step closer and look at Chicago itself, which took it one step further than what Illinois had did.
And candidly, Chicago's not on its own. We've seen this with other major cities, New York City being one that has different employment laws above and beyond state requirements.
Yeah, we got another question in. This is a good one. Does unlimited PTO affect employees differently if they are exempt versus non-exempt employees? And maybe just a short summary of the difference because, we live in this world, but not everyone knows immediately what exempt and non-exempt are.
Sure. So exempt employees are those employees who are not subject to overtime requirements under the FLSA. Typically, your exempt employees are going to be your administrative, executive, managerial employees, highly compensated employees. Uh-huh. Non-exempt are really everyone else. The salaried versus hourly is the traditional comparator that's not always completely accurate.
It trips up employers a lot, yeah.
But when we're looking at that, your non-exempt employees are more likely to be your hourly employees.
Got it. And so in terms of how companies implement unlimited or flex PTO, how would that come into play if somebody's an exempt versus a non-exempt? Like in terms of, I guess where it would come into play is the number of hours, because a lot of times for exempt employees, you're going to take full day increment, absences, whereas hourly, you can kind of take as little as you want.
Right. Typically with exempt employees, we're looking at either half day or full day increments. With non-exempt employees, usually I'm looking at 15-minute increments is kind of the most that I would do. Yeah. I think when it comes to unlimited PTO or flex policies with hourly employees, with your non-exempt employees, I think it's almost a little bit easier because candidly, you're already seeing that time. You know the amount of time that's being worked, and you have some idea of what you would expect and what you are receiving. With your exempt employees, this is again where really that performance becomes critical because with an exempt employee, you're not necessarily looking at the hours that are going in. In some cases you are. Yeah. But exempt employees, the focus really is on the performance.
Yeah, the one thing I would raise, though, is for non-exempt employees, for hourly employees, where overtime, as for employment lawyers and for companies, overtime always sits up there, you really do then, you might have to have a little bit more of a tracking system because, if you're taking an hour increment here, an hour increment there, and there is a dispute down the road, we see this all the time. Employee in these overtime claims always say, I work 12 hours, 15 hours a day for 7 days a week, and I'm being facetious a little bit, but you do see that. And the way the Fair Labor Standards Act works is the burden is on the company to be able to refute that with actual paperwork. So that's where it gets a little bit tougher, and that's where tracking unfortunately might, and that's where you mentioned this earlier. That's where maybe one size fits all does not work. Maybe you don't have unlimited or flex PTO with hourly employees if that issue is going to creep up.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think your issue about records, I cannot emphasize this enough. For your hourly employees, you need to have records, and they need to be clear records. They don't need to be complicated records. The DOL is very clear on what you need. But so many employers simply don't have those records for hourly employees.
So we've talked about how this is a relatively new and it's a developing area of the law. And so, of course, leave it to California. They always are on the cutting edge of making HR's lives so wonderful. Let's talk about one particular case, the McPherson case, because like we said, very few have come up. What is the McPherson case? How does that deal with this issue of unlimited?
So McPherson is a 2020 case, I believe. And the issue in McPherson was whether or not a managerial employee was entitled to be paid out for PTO at the time of termination. The facts are a little important here in that the company had an accrued PTO policy for most of its employees, but had this de facto unlimited PTO policy for some of the managers. And, the court took issue with it. The court was very clear to say that they were not cutting down all unlimited PTO policies, but this one in particular. And there were a few points that were critical. Number one, what the court found was that the policy was never actually communicated to the managers. Yeah. So there was no clear policy. They did not understand they had this quote-unquote unlimited policy. I think the other thing that I thought was really interesting in the court's opinion was the court came to the conclusion that this concept of unlimited PTO was simply not realistic. There was no way that the workers could get their work done and still have the freedoms that are supposedly associated with unlimited PTO.
Yeah, so what it says is courts are not just going to accept some nomenclature that you throw on your leave policy. They're going to look behind it. We talked earlier about how crucial it is to have a policy. In this particular case, as you've mentioned, they really didn't have a policy, so they couldn't even really convey it. It was de facto. It was just kind of like, well, okay, this is kind of how we treat people. It's kind of like, well, we've never really tracked it before, so I guess it just becomes one. That's not going to cut it anymore.
And it's not good once you get into litigation, and candidly, it's not good for your employees generally. If you're going to put your employees in this situation, it's only fair to give them guidelines and guardrails as you've stated.
I'm trying to think any other cases that we've come across. Nothing that provides like a whole lot of guidance, I think, at this stage.
No, and really that's part of the issue. As attorneys, we look at what has happened in the past and what courts have said and what DOL has said for guidance on how this is going to be interpreted. And we don't have that yet.
Yes. So we had already planned to wrap this one up a little bit quicker because yours truly booked a plane in about an hour and 15 minutes.
I'm going to make it. PTO, Declan?
This is unlimited PTO, exactly. I didn't leave myself enough time. Let's see.
Speaking of lead time, we do have
a lead time question. How much lead time should I provide employees when transitioning to unlimited PTO?
I'm going to hedge the answer on this.
Okay.
Because it really is going to depend upon what state you are in or your employees are in. It's also going to depend upon your circumstances. And again, I think this is where you need to be coordinating with your employment counsel to really plan for how this is going to go. Some states will require a notice of at least one pay period. Others are a number of months. I think particularly if you're going to do some sort of grace period, a transition period to use up PTO, existing accrued PTO, I would probably say, 3 to 6 months would be a fair amount.
Got it. Okay. Well, as we wrap this one up, Any final thoughts, just kind of high level, on when companies are considering going this route?
I think before you go this route, I think you need to make sure that your HR house is in order. And if it is not in order, you're just creating issues for yourself, because it's critical that you have both an evaluation process, criteria for your employees for performance, that evaluation, that you're ready, willing, and able to follow through on disciplinary issues effectively. And then also that you know what your legal requirements are under the FMLA and the other associated laws, because I think that's really where people are going to get tripped up here.
Yeah, it's really good advice. And listen, thanks for joining me on this. It's a good discussion. And thanks for all the people watching live. We will also be pushing this out in our various means, the recording of it. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Again, this stuff is very fact-specific, company-specific, depending on where you're operating, what kind of leave that you provide. So, we by no means could this ever solve all of those issues. So feel free to reach out to us for that. We do these Be Your HR Best webinars on a quarterly basis. So we've got 3 more to do for 2024. Really appreciate everybody and hope you found this useful today.
Thank you.